Good evening. My name is Tom, and I am a follower of Jesus Christ who is powerless over alcohol and sex, a whole bunch of other stuff. But today, by His grace, I can choose recovery. My sobriety date from alcohol, Arlene told me I had to tell you this, is March the 1st of 1984. By God's grace. And the thing is, before I actually came into recovery from alcoholism, I was living in the Midwest in Springfield, Missouri, and I came to one morning out of an alcoholic blackout. And I found myself talking to the local office of Alcoholics Anonymous in a phone booth. For those of you who don't know what theirs are, you can Google that. Now, to make a long story short, I went to some AA meetings, and I even stayed dry for a short time. And like around here, Choose Recovery, they read the 12 steps at every meeting. And as I went to the meetings and I listened to all this, I kept hearing about that 9th step and all the other steps, and I knew with absolute certainty that there was no way on God's green earth that I could do any of that stuff or even really wanted to do all of that stuff, especially the part about making amends for the harm I had done. What I wanted was to stop getting fired for being drunk. I wanted my wife to not hate me as much. I wanted the DUIs and the arrests to stop. I definitely was not interested in all that inventory and amends stuff. And either nobody told me, and that's why I'm making a big point of this, or I didn't hear it. But there was something we need to hear. Because after a short time, I used my distaste for those amends and all that step stuff to send me back to drinking. And what happened was I got 5 more years of getting the stuff I definitely did not want because I didn't hear somebody say this. I mean, I kept getting the DUI, all that stuff. And here is what I want you to hear, and I ask you, please listen carefully. If you are just beginning this recovery process, or you are not at the step we are looking at tonight, please relax and take it easy. Don't put a lot of undue stress on yourself. You don't have to do the things we're talking about, not for a little while anyway. So you don't have to get all bent up. Relax. Just enjoy and take in what we've got. Take it in. If there's something that really hits home or you need to ask about, ask somebody who's been around this thing for a while. But that does bring us to tonight's lesson. And it is step 8, and we read it just a minute ago, but I'd like to invite you to read it again. And it's step 8. It says, we made a list of all persons we had harmed and became willing to make amends to them all. Do to others as you would have them do to you. Luke 6. Well, Arlene, we're talking about this week, and we came to an agreement on a couple of real important points about this. First off, step 8, this step is not about doing anything for anybody or doing anything to anybody else. It is simply about becoming willing to make amends. The operative words here are become willing. Now, I'm reasonably certain that working steps 1 through 7 help us to be ready to take this step. In fact, I know they do, but being ready is not quite being willing. So you see, step 8 is about mentally, and first and foremost, it is about becoming mentally and emotionally willing. And you can tell you're willing because it's always followed up by an appropriate, timely, properly guided action. But there again, tonight we're talking about not action, but we're talking about becoming willing. And the other principle that is involved in tonight's lesson, and I think this one and even the next one, is this principle of forgiveness. Now, we talk about forgiveness, and it's a principle that seems pretty simple. Forgiveness, by definition, is giving up the right to strike back at somebody who has harmed us. Forgiveness, from the dictionary, I think it was the Cambridge, it says to stop blaming or being angry with somebody for something that person has done, or to not punish them for something. Now, those definitions are fairly simple and straightforward, and it conveys kind of what we're talking about. But like an awful lot of simple ideas, they seem easy enough until we come face to face with actually putting this stuff into practice. Would you agree with me on that? That's why taking the time to become willing is most definitely worth doing. How many of us have things in our past that seem unforgivable? How many have had harms done to us that seem unforgivable? Or maybe there are some hurts that have been done to us that we just won't forgive. Most of us have at least a little bit of that in our life. I know I had one incident that I was involved in. It took me 2 years before I would even confess it to my sponsor, never mind look at forgiveness. And it took a while longer, quite a while longer, before I was able to believe that God could forgive me and then actually go to the point of accepting His forgiveness and then forgiving myself. You see, I had to become willing to embrace God's idea of forgiveness. And I have to say that without at least some hope of forgiveness, some belief that somehow there was a way for me to be forgiven for all that junk I had done in my years of drinking, and some afterward, unfortunately, I don't think I would have seriously attempted these steps. And I started getting that hope in the rooms of recovery in Alcoholics Anonymous from the people in recovery that assured me that God could and God would forgive me. And then I came to know that with certainty when I surrendered to Christ. You see, when I'm dealing with difficult issues in recovery and in life, I need to be reminded of this first really big idea, that forgiveness is God's idea. He made this up. He dreamed this up. I need to remember constantly that God is love. You ever heard that one before? God is love. His forgiveness is a natural outpouring of His love for us. There are so many places in the Bible and other literature that show and display His love for us. And even in my own life, I have seen and experienced His forgiveness. And in the lives of those around me in recovery, we have seen, and I've seen the effects of God's forgiveness upon their lives. And there's so much spoken and written about this, I decided to choose one simple verse that I think illustrates it as well as any. And it's written by a man named Paul in a book called Romans, and it says these words: "But God demonstrates His own love for us in this, that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us." It's Romans chapter 5, verse 8. I'm going to make this statement that the greatest display of love and forgiveness from God came in the form of His Son, Jesus of Nazareth. Nothing, and I mean nothing, in all of human history has displayed the truth of God's love quite like the birth, death, and resurrection of His Son, Jesus Christ. Nothing in all of history. You see, we don't have to get it all right. You don't have to clean up and be made right. You don't have to be okay in order for us to really experience God's forgiveness and the truth of the resurrection and the salvation through Jesus Christ. But there is a little bit of a trick to this, and it's my first point, and there's a fill in the blank for it. It says, I need to become willing to accept God's forgiveness. I'm not just talking about agreeing with it or believing it. I'm talking about accepting it. You see, the beginning of forgiveness, this principle in our lives, is when we are willing to accept God's forgiveness. I'm talking deep down, gut level, all the way down here where it counts, not just in our head. Maybe not just in our hearts, but all the way down. And God's forgiveness is complete and it is total. Jesus said these words. He says, "It is finished." He said it as he was dying on the cross. And what he said, what I take from that is no matter how grievously we may have injured others or ourselves, the grace of God is sufficient. His forgiveness is always complete. Let's also remember that God's forgiveness is a gift of His grace and His love. It's not like human forgiveness. All I need to do is accept it. You see, humans, we want amends and apologies. God says, "Come, I've already paid for it." I'd like to add a note here, and it was one I was told by my sponsor, and since we're running a little later than normal, I'm going to shorten it down. We have to accept His forgiveness, and we have to forgive ourselves. And my sponsor asked me very simply, who are you to withhold the forgiveness from yourself that God has given to you already? He said, "Are you God?" That hurt, but it reminded me. Self-forgiveness is not a license for irresponsibility. It is simply an acknowledgement that we are human and that, like everybody else, we have reached a stage in recovery to where we are able to give ourselves the same grace God has given us. But then we're given so we can give, and that becomes my next point. We become willing to make amends to those we've harmed. Before we continue on this point, I'd like to let you look at a video that'll show you what amends and what forgiveness is not. Can we play this, please? Watch the screen. Okay, so that was a little ridiculous, but I'll tell you what, I'm not sure it was that far off the mark for some of us in the way we view forgiveness, is it? Or making amends. You see, amends or seeking forgiveness is not about groveling or begging. It's not about allowing others to walk all over us. It is not about offering unreasonable or ridiculous repayment or compensation. Making amends is about honestly admitting our fault to the people we have harmed and being willing to make it right wherever possible. Making amends may or may not bring about forgiveness, but it does bring about a clear conscience and a great deal more. You see, my daughter's mother, my first wife, never forgave me, and I can't say I really blamed her for it, for the many ways I harmed her. But by making my own amends and working my own program of recovery over an extended period of time, that means making direct amends and living in this recovery, I found that my conscience was clear. And no, there was never a reconciliation or even harmony in our relationship. But there was at least enough of a truce as far as my daughter was concerned. And you know what? As far as I know, she took that bitterness with her to her grave. And I've got to tell you, there's a part of me that weeps for that. And yet my relationship with that young woman, my daughter, is an ongoing, growing, healthy, loving relationship. She called me and says, "Pop, Dad." Jesus said this about amends. He said, "Therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to them, and then come and offer your gift." This is really important stuff. Jesus said so. So let's ask ourselves, am I willing to become willing to make amends with or without the forgiveness? We can pray for it and ask for it, but we make the amends all the same. And this last point that we're going to make is maybe one of the most difficult aspects of this whole principle of forgiveness. And it says, we become willing to forgive those who have harmed us. And don't you sometimes wish you had a magic pill you could take to where you could just become willing to make amends? Because the scriptures are here again. The author is a man named Paul who knew a little bit about this stuff. He said, "Bear with each other and forgive one another if any of you has a grievance against someone. And he says, forgive as the Lord forgave you. He puts it back to what Jesus did. We are to forgive, and we are to keep forgiving even when it's difficult. And I'm with the rest of you. There's some of this stuff that I just need to be willing. But I also know what I've been taught, that we have to let go of the pain of the past, harm and abuse caused by others. Let me repeat that. We must let go of the harm and the pain they have caused us. You see, forgiveness of the hurt done to us will probably not change that other person. It will probably not undo the harm. The harm is still there. But it will bring transformation and healing for the wounds that have been done to you. Now, for some situations, it could be as simple as saying, I forgive. But for other situations, it could be a process, maybe even a little bit of a long one, to where we can become willing to forgive and then seek God's power and grace. Because there's some of this stuff I can't do without God's power and grace. But it's good to remember that old cliche of saying holding resentment is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. Many of you have heard that, because that's what it is like. Remember that anger that we hold on to is really only hurting one person the most. Let me give you a hint. That's you. That's me. And I do not think we find peace or freedom either from our perpetrators or the harm they've done until we at least are become willing to forgive. Remember one other point. Forgiving them in no way excuses them for the harm they have caused you. It never says that's okay. But through the process, it can release you from the power that they have had over you. We can say, I forgive because God has already forgiven me. And with His help and with His power and grace, I can forgive others, even those who have hurt me. You see, when we forgive, we don't change the past. We acknowledge the past. But we sure do change our future. And that's really what this is all about. And let's remember, we're simply looking at in this 8th step, and there's going to be more on this step, that it begins with willingness. Yes, we make a list. Yes, we are willing to make amends. And yes, the willingness to enter into forgiveness. That is absolutely essential for joyful, free recovery. Notice the amazing worship team is coming back up here again. That's always good news. And we're going to open the altar. Because just like all this other step stuff that I ran away from so long ago, I can't do it without God. I cannot forgive without accepting God's forgiveness. I cannot make amends without the grace of God empowering me. I cannot forgive others without God. And I would be remiss if I didn't say that most of us have at least something that either needs to be forgiven, we need to receive forgiveness for, or maybe we just need to be willing to forgive and accept forgiveness. It's all by the grace of God and by His power. And we open this altar so that we have a moment, whether it's something we need to forgive, a hurt that we can't let go of, a harm that we can't be free of, to seek God. And remember that this is the God of love and, yes, the God of forgiveness. Please come as the Spirit leads.